The swearing-in ceremonies and the inaugural address of President John F. Kennedy, United States Capitol, January 20th, 1961.
Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace, proud of our ancient heritage, and unwilling to witness or permit the slow undoing of those human rights to which this nation has always been committed and to which we are committed today at home and around the world.
The 1960s are remembered for being a time where civil rights was one of America's defining struggles. President John F. Kennedy was not truly concerned with the civil rights movement. He did not take a clear stand on the issues, and he seemed to share FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover's fear that the movement was inspired by communism. All around the country, tensions would escalate to the point where he could no longer ignore them. The Birmingham campaign in May 1963 made President Kennedy realize that the United States couldn't call itself the champion of freedom throughout the world while maintaining a system of racial inequality at home. In June, he went on national television to call for the passage of a law that would ban discrimination in all places of public accommodation, a major goal of the civil rights movement.
We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the Scriptures and is as clear as the American Constitution. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities, whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated. If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public school available, if he cannot vote for the public officials who represent him, if, in short, he cannot enjoy the full and free life which all of us want, then who among us would be content to have the color of his skin changed and stand in his place?
President Kennedy did not live to see his civil rights bill enacted. It fell to his successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, to secure passage of the Civil Rights Bill just 5 days after his assassination. Congress passed the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which prohibited racial discrimination in employment institutions like hospitals, schools, restaurants, hotels, and more. However, the 1964 law didn't address a major concern of the civil rights movement, the right to vote in the South. This is where the Freedom-Southern Project takes its place in history.
It was 1964. African Americans had been given the right to vote almost 100 years earlier, yet fewer than 7% had registered, and it was no wonder.
You'd be fired from your job if you even tried to go down and register to vote. If you had a loan, any kind of loan, they would cut your loan. They would publish your name in the paper. Then there was something called the registrar who would then make you take a test. And inevitably, if you're African American, you fail.
You didn't write anything in there. You didn't pass.
Between 1961 through 1965, an estimated 25 black civil workers paid with their lives. 35 bombings and numerous beatings of civil rights workers happened in Mississippi in the summer of 1964. People were extremely violent in Mississippi. If black people tried to vote, they got hurt. Blacks who tried to register faced intimidation, violence, and arrest at the courthouse. After leaving the courthouse, they faced arrest on trumped-up charges for nearly a century. Segregation had prevented most African Americans in Mississippi from voting or holding office. In 1964, less than 5% of blacks were registered to vote due to intimidation. Groups such as the Ku Klux Klan imposed violence on black residents and civil rights workers. Between June 16 and September 30, 1964, there were at least 6 murders, 29 shootings, 50 bombings, and 60 beatings. The murders were meant to terrorize thousands of young people who had enlisted in Freedom Summer. 3 civil rights workers which were James Cheney, Michael Schwerner, and Andrew Goodman, had been killed because of their efforts to empower African Americans to cast their vote.
In June 1964, Bob Moses announced Freedom Summer.
We hope to send into Mississippi this summer upwards of 1,000 teachers, ministers, lawyers, and students from all around the country who will engage in what we're calling freedom schools, community center programs, voter registration activity, research work, work in the white communities, and in general, a program designed to open up Mississippi to the country.
Opening up Mississippi would not be easy. Local newspapers warned of a coming invasion. Governor Paul Johnson called for more highway patrolmen. The city of Jackson ordered an armored truck for riot control, all to resist college students from across the country who had volunteered to work in the state during the summer.
Most of the students that and people we were bringing in for the summer project were from the large universities, and they were from families who were politicians, bankers, lawyers, and others. And we felt by the fact that bringing in those particular people, that the attention of their parents and relatives from the various different other parts of the country would be on these areas. And by having large numbers of whites in here, is the press, the American public would have much more concern than if there were just a bunch of blacks that were in the state.
On 1961, Robert Paris Moses went down to Mississippi to try to register the African American community. Unfortunately, he was unsuccessful, therefore he came up with the idea to draw attention to Mississippi by involving white students. Less than 7% of African Americans in Mississippi were registered to vote, compared to between 50 to 70% in other southern states. A coalition of civil rights groups, including SNCC, CORE, and AACP, collaborated to bring voter registration and education to the African American population of Mississippi. They believed that this would force the media and the country to take notice of the violence and injustices taking place. In the summer of 1964, Freedom Summer volunteers went down to Mississippi. They spread across the state and embedded themselves with local black families. These volunteers went door to door to try to register African Americans, and they also set up freedom schools for children where African American history and culture was taught. Before the first day, all of the volunteers went to a training program in Oxford, Ohio. The training was meant to prepare them on what was to be expected, such as violence and racial slurs. But 3 of the volunteers did not go to the training. Instead, they went down to Mississippi to check on a church that had been recently bombed. They were not heard from again.
Ku Klux Klan membership in Mississippi soared to more than 10,000 in 1964. Klan membership in Neshoba County included businessmen, law enforcement, and prominent members of the community. The Klan was prepared to use violence to fight the project, and on April 24, the group staged 61 simultaneous cross burnings throughout the state. They proceeded to burn 20 black churches over the course of the summer of that year.
On June 21, 1964, Michael Schwerner, Andrew Goodman, and James Cheney were kidnapped and killed near Philadelphia, Mississippi, and were found until August 4th. The murder investigation was led by J. Edgar Hoover, and he believed the KKK had been involved. According to the documentary Freedom Summer, investigators combed through the woods, fields, swamps, and the rivers of Mississippi. They found 8 African American bodies. 2 were identified as Henry D. and Charles Moore, who were college students that had been kidnapped, beaten, and murdered in May. Another corpse was wearing a court t-shirt, and even less information was recorded about the 5 other bodies. These discoveries promoted fear among the white community because 2 of the victims from the project were white. Rita, a court worker, said, "The slaying of a Negro in Mississippi is not news. It is only because my husband and Andrew Goodman were white that the national alarm has been sounded." The deaths of these 2 white students focused unprecedented attention on Mississippi and the inability of the federal government to protect their citizens, who were only seeking to enjoy their constitutional rights.
Thousands of law enforcement agents for 44 days were looking for my brother's body and James and Mickey. They dredged out of the swamps 9 black bodies who no one had even heard of. There's multiple levels of tragedy in this story. One of them that is most poignant for me, besides losing my brother, was that it took 2 white kids to legitimize the tragedy of being murdered if you wanted to vote.
And it took decades to achieve any kind of justice for the murders of Andy Goodman, James Chaney, and Mickey Schwerner. 18 men were arrested in 1967. Half a dozen were convicted, but only of civil rights violations. None served more than 6 years. No one was convicted of murder.
As part of the Freedom Summer Project, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party was formed. The MFDP opened up to people of all races. During this time, African Americans were unable to participate in the political activities of the Democratic Party, so they went on to challenge the state's all-white delegation at the 1964 Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City. Party liberals offered a compromise in which 2 of the state seats would be given to 2 black delegates, but the MFDP promptly refused.
5 days after arriving in Atlantic City, Hubert Humphrey told the Freedom Party delegates to accept a new compromise. Aaron Henry and Reverend Ed King would be seated as at-large delegates. The rest of the Freedom delegates could attend the convention but not vote.
The president was naming for black Mississippians who their leaders would be. Even Aaron said that's too much like the plantation.
So that's kind of like saying, turn over to us all of that which you have, and we will examine it and tell you which of it is legitimate. And to me, that was a huge slap in the face.
The murder of Shanae, Goodman, and Schwerner brought national attention to Freedom Summer and remains a flashpoint in our historical memory of the civil rights movement. The students came to understand that their pursuit of freedom and equal citizenship rights through producing and distributing the Freedom News or participating in a civil rights protest meant that they would become a part of history. Freedom Summer helped create laws ratified promoting social change in the South. The Mississippi Freedom Summer's unique history afforded blacks economic, political, and educational advances not available in other areas around the country. The Mississippi Summer Project gained attention in the national press, providing encouragement for overcoming their fears. African Americans had previously been afraid to confront the white power structure, but during the summer of 1964, local African Americans participated in large numbers in the movement, especially after being violently attacked by the white population in places like Neshoba and southwest Mississippi. A large amount of African Americans tried to register to vote, and surprisingly, large amounts of African American school children and adults studied in the Freedom Schools and helped in the movement. Not until June 2005, 41 years after Freedom Summer, did a Mississippi jury convict a member of the Ku Klux Klan of manslaughter in the deaths of 3 civil rights workers. Goodman, Shanae, and Schwerner gave their lives in the struggle for basic democratic rights, and their sacrifice will continue to inspire future generations. The Western campus at Miami University has a magnificent stone monument dedicated to the Freedom Summer of 1964.
Thank you for watching our video. We hope that it gave you a better understanding and appreciation for the struggles Americans fought for and are still fighting for today.